By the late 1940s, the smoke of global war has begun to clear. In Europe, the iron fist of conflict gave way to a fragile and now divided Germany. In Asia, the clash of ideologies reached its grim finale as the Chinese Civil War crowned Mao, locking the East in a new geopolitical orbit. The world, scarred and tired, is desperately trying to stitch itself back together. As a result of this healing process, South and Middle America inadvertently become frontlines in a new, cold, and different conflict. Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we cover the events of a decade after World War II that brought man from the brink of destruction to the threshold of the stars. I am Sebastian Brandstetter. Much of the Americas stands on the edge of transformation, not by bombs or battlefronts, but by whispers in the corridors of power, sudden coups, rising populists, and the deepening shadow of foreign influence. While old elites cling to privilege, new leaders promise rebirth. Empires receded, but their hands lingered. This is not tranquility, it is the quiet before the storm. Latin America, almost untouched by the scars of the Second World War, now is a vulnerable theater in the struggle between East and West. Though far from Washington or Moscow, the continent becomes a strategic playground where ideology, influence, and intelligence collide as two new superpowers emerge from the ruins of the war. To understand the political arena of Latin America, we need to briefly travel back in time. To be specific, we need to go back to the beginning of the 19th century. Then, huge waves of independent movements, inspired mainly by the American War of Independence and the French Revolution, swallow the former Portuguese and Spanish colonial empires. By the 1820s, more than 11 countries have gained their full independence. And in the same decade, a new revolutionary foreign policy is defined by the US government, carrying the name of the president who instituted it, the Monroe Doctrine. As President Monroe himself explains, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. In other words, any interference by European power in the affairs of the nations in the Americas would be considered a hostile act against the United States. The Americas are US turf, nice and simple. The United States, seeking to support these new nations and prevent further European influence in the region, employs the Monroe Doctrine to establish a clear boundary. Although the US lacks the military strength necessary to enforce the doctrine in its early years, luckily, the British Navy helps deter recolonization. Out of self-interest, you understand. If they can't have the colonies in the Americas, or a colony in the Americas, neither should other colonial powers. Makes sense. Although the US does not only make demands, it also gives European powers an incentive to stick to the Monroe Doctrine. If European powers stayed out of the Americas, so too the US will stay out of Europe. Over time, the doctrine is used and reinterpreted by different US presidents to justify various actions. For example, President Theodore Roosevelt adopted the aptly named Roosevelt Corollary in 1904, asserting the US's right to interfere in Latin American countries in cases of chronic wrongdoing. This marks a shift from merely opposing European interference to actively involving the US in regional affairs. While the Monroe Doctrine was initially a protective policy, it later becomes a tool for American interventionism and expansionism. Some Latin American nations view it with suspicion, seeing it as a justification and simple pretense for US dominance in the region. Then again, other countries prefer to align with a former colony such as the United States, hoping that solidarity would finally bar the old colonial powers from reclaiming influence in their continent. In either case, both have a new hegemon. This marks the roots the US has already spread throughout the Americas by the dawn of the Cold War. In said Cold War, the United States no longer sees the colonial empires as its principal rivals, though. No. Its new rival is an anti-imperialist empire in rhetoric but not in action, one that promises liberation while demanding loyalty, the Soviet Union. From the October Revolution of 1917, Until the formation of the Allied front against Nazi Germany, only 3 countries, and that intermittently, the United States, Mexico, and Uruguay, recognized the Soviet Union as the legitimate government of Russia. However, following Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and the subsequent wartime alliance between the US and the USSR, recognition of the Soviet government began to spread. By the end of 1945, nearly every nation in the Americas formally acknowledged the USSR. Among all these countries, Mexico is of special importance to Moscow. In fact, Mexico was the first country in the Americas to officially recognize the Soviet Union, establishing diplomatic relations in August 1924. Then, from the mid-1930s, Mexico has not only turned into a political center for communist ideas in Latin America, no, it has also become a significant spy zone for Soviet agents. This early recognition was partly due to the ideological alignment between the post-revolutionary Mexico and the Soviet regime. Both countries had, after all, undergone revolutions, Mexico in 1910 and Russia in 1917, and both governments promised anti-imperialist, socialist-leaning rhetoric, even if their interpretation and implementation differed. Yet, former relations remain rocky. For instance, the Soviet ambassador, Stanislav Peskovsky, faces political friction and is expelled in 1930 due to the accusations of interfering in Mexican politics. Despite the 1930 severing of formal diplomatic ties, Soviet influence persisted unofficially through leftist intellectuals, labor movements, and the Communist Party of Mexico, PCM, which maintained close Comintern links, a global network with representatives from over 60 countries. That is why the 1920s and 1930s see a huge wave of Mexican leftist movements, which include labor unions and intellectuals, as we already mentioned, who look to the USSR as a model for revolutionary change. The PCM, though often marginalized politically, also has strong links with the Soviet Union and receives guidance and financial support from Moscow. It helps promote Soviet policies, including class struggle, anti-clericalism, and workers' rights. Then there are also artists like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Rivera, in particular, briefly even a member of the PCM, incorporated pro-Soviet and anti-capitalist themes in his murals. While he is later expelled from the party, his work exemplifies how Soviet ideology filtered into Mexican cultural and political discourse. One of the most dramatic episodes of Soviet influence in Mexico comes with the exile of Leon Trotsky, the exiled Soviet revolutionary and rival of Joseph Stalin. Trotsky is granted asylum in Mexico in 1937, in part due to efforts by Diego Rivera and Kahlo. There, he lives under protection in Mexico City and continues his opposition to Stalin from abroad. Why? Well, because Leon Trotsky, the former leader of the Red Army, does not believe in socialism in one state like Stalin. Instead, he believes in permanent revolution and the maximal effort to export the revolution across the globe, with no home at all. Trotsky is usually interpreted as the left opposition of Stalin. As a result, Soviet hostility toward Trotsky culminates in his assassination in 1940 by Ramon Mercader, a Spanish communist and NKVD, that's the Soviet secret police, agent. The murder, carried out with Stalin's approval and at his expressed behest, is a clear example of Soviet operational reach and willingness to eliminate political enemies even on foreign soil. However, with the world entering a new era, a Cold War, Mexico is slowly but steadily inching closer to the United States, the US quickly becoming its primary economic and political partner. As a result, official ties with the Soviet Union remain what they were, distant and minimal. Although in the meantime, Mexico maintains a policy of non-intervention and neutrality, avoiding overt alignment with either the US or the USSR in ideological terms. But then, anti-communist sentiment grows during this time, especially during the presidency of Miguel Alemán from 1946 to 1952, leading to increased surveillance and repression of local communist movements. At the same time, the United States starts a program of economic assistance to Mexico, which finances infrastructure and industrial development projects. Technical assistance programs also support agricultural modernization, public health initiatives, and education. Private American capital also flows into Mexico, particularly in the oil, mining, and manufacturing industries. Although this investment is not official aid like that given to Europe in the Marshall Plan, it is part of a broader economic relationship that often benefits from US diplomatic support. In return, Mexico maintains political stability and avoids alignment with the Soviet bloc. But is the United States providing economic assistance to all Latin American countries to prevent Soviet influence? Well, no, not exactly. A little further south, we see a nation ruled not by a government, but by a company. This is the strange reality of mid-century Guatemala. For decades, the United Fruit Company, an American corporation, has loomed large over Guatemala. It controls more than 40% of the country's farmable land, though it leaves much of it uncultivated. It owns the nation's only railroad, its primary port, and even wields sizable influence over the postal system. In many ways, United Fruit Company doesn't just operate in Guatemala, it is Guatemala. Most Guatemalans, meanwhile, live in abject poverty. A small elite owns nearly all the land, while indigenous communities and poor farmers struggle. In 1951, President Jacobo Arbenz rises to power. And Arbenz is part of a wave of democratic reformers who want to modernize Guatemala after decades of dictatorship. In 1952, he introduces Decree 900, a sweeping land reform law that expropriates unused land from large estates and redistributes it to the landless masses. Over 100,000 families benefit from the policy. But among the lands seized are the vast holdings of the United Fruit Company, and it is furious. It receives compensation, sure, but it argues that its land is worth far, far more than what it gets. And more than that, United Fruit sees its long-standing dominance in the region slipping. Luckily for United Fruit, and unluckily for Guatemalans, the company's influence reaches deep into the US government. The problem becomes more serious when President Arbenz makes close contact with the newly legalized, that was in 1949, still before his presidency, and formally banned Communist Party, the PCG, which is under some Soviet influence. Although not a communist himself, he and the communists find common ground in some policies. In Washington, several key members of the Eisenhower administration, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, CIA Director Allen Dulles, and others have ties to United Fruit, whether through former legal work or investments. And in the early 1950s, they're deeply anxious about any sign of leftist reform in Latin America. Arbenz, though not a communist, allows communists to participate in his government. That's enough to raise alarms on its own. And United Fruit, for its part, ensures those alarms are heard loud and clear. So, the CIA launches Operation PB Success, a covert campaign to remove Arbenz. They fund and train a rebel force led by ex-Site military officer Carlos Castillo Armas and wage a psychological war against the Guatemalan people, spreading fear, dropping leaflets, and broadcasting false reports of massive rebel victories. US planes buzz the capital. The pressure mounts. As a result, in June 1954, Arbenz resigns. His hope for a democratic, independent Guatemala dies in that moment. Castillo Armas takes over with US backing, begins rolling back all the reforms, and opens the doors to decades of military rule and repression. Over the next 40 years, Guatemala will plunge into a brutal civil war. More than 200,000 people, mostly indigenous civilians, will be killed or simply disappear. This war will be known as the Guatemalan Civil War. In response to this, General Secretary of the Soviet Union Nikita Khrushchev says, "What they did in Guatemala, they will try to do everywhere, in Cuba and Vietnam and Africa. But the people of the world are awakening, and they will not forever tolerate the gangster methods of American imperialism." Speaking of which, at the same time, in 1952, in the streets of La Paz, one of the capitals of Bolivia, echo with chants from miners and peasants. Yes, you heard that right. Bolivia still has two capitals. One is La Paz, the seat of government, and Sucre, the constitutional capital. The National Revolutionary Movement, MNR, has just seized power in a dramatic uprising, toppling the oligarchy and launching one of Latin America's most radical social transformations. Watching all this unfold in the offices of US companies, a sense of unease settles in. This isn't Guatemala just yet, but it might start to feel like it soon. The MNR moves quickly. It nationalizes the country's tin mines, the backbone of the Bolivian economy, previously controlled by a trio of powerful families. Then, like Arbenz in Guatemala, it launches sweeping agrarian reform, again redistributing land from large estates to indigenous farmers. On April 9, 1952, Pravda, the Soviet Union's biggest newspaper and propaganda mouthpiece, starts its headline with a stunning text. The people of Bolivia have risen against the oligarchy and their masters in Washington. The nationalization of the tin mine strikes a blow against the Anglo-American monopolies. If the revolution deepens, Bolivia could become a beacon for all of Latin America. The government even dismantles the old military, replacing it with worker and peasant militias, loyal to the cause. These are not piecemeal reforms, they are foundational. Although the Soviet Union has little to no involvement on the ground, and even the Communist Party of Bolivia is very cautious, since it sees the MNR as petit bourgeois, middle class, the US watches nervously nevertheless. This is Cold War territory, and the revolution smells too much like socialism or worse, communism. But instead of moving to overthrow the new government, as they will do in Guatemala 2 years later, the US makes a different choice. Here, they decide to co-opt the revolution. In 1953, Washington begins simply pouring money into Bolivia. Millions of dollars in foreign aid, food shipments, and development programs arrive, with strings attached. The CIA and US diplomats work quietly behind the scenes, pushing the MNR toward moderation, encouraging anti-communist stances, and cultivating allies within the party. The goal is clear: steer the revolution away from the left, prevent any alliance with Moscow, and secure regional US economic interests. The American businessmen in La Paz know the playbook. Land seizures have already begun. And while American companies aren't necessarily the main target, as they will be in Guatemala, the signs are troubling. Nationalization, labor militancy, rural organizing. Bolivia is becoming a test case not just for revolutionary reform, but for how far a small Latin American country can go without crossing Washington's red line. Then, by the mid-1950s, the US strategy begins to bear fruit and the revolution begins to cool down. US influence grows, and internal divisions in the MNR weaken its radical edge. Still, for a few years, Bolivia stands as a rare case where a left-leaning revolution survives, if barely, under the shadow of the United States. Sure, from the polished office windows of the foreign companies, the slogans in the street are still loud, but now they are mixed with the quiet hum of American dollars. That's the sound those companies want to hear. At the same time, somewhere very close to the coasts of Florida, a tiny island named Cuba is a country marked by contrasts. Havana is a vibrant city, known for its nightlife, music, and steady flow of American tourists. The economy appears strong on the surface, heavily supported by sugar exports and foreign, mostly American, investment. However, beneath this prosperity lies widespread inequality. Much of the population, particularly in rural areas, lives in poverty, with limited access to education, healthcare, and land. In 1952, former President and Army General Fulgencio Batista takes power once more in a military coup and simply cancels the upcoming elections. His return to power marks a turning point. While the United States supports Batista's regime, seeing it as a reliable ally against communism and a protector of American business interests, many Cubans see it as corrupt and increasingly repressive. One of the main groups that will soon become Batista's #1 target are the communists, especially the Popular Socialist Party, PSP. Batista allows the American companies to dominate key sectors of the economy, including sugar, mining, and tourism, while political freedoms at home erode away. About a year later, on July 26, 1953, a tall and skinny young man, alongside 160 other armed young revolutionaries, decides to lead an assault on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, hoping to spark a nationwide uprising against the dictatorship of Batista. Not a long time ago, in 1940, this young man wrote a letter to then US President Franklin Roosevelt, asking him to give him a green $10 bill, since he had never seen one. His letter was and will never be answered, and his name is Fidel Castro. At the moment, while he is inspired by communist ideas, Castro is a nationalist reformist. But that can change. Anyway, his plan, the storming of the barracks, quickly unravels. Poor coordination and strong military resistance result in heavy losses. Many rebels are killed and others, including Castro, are captured. Despite its failure, the attack becomes a powerful symbol of resistance. Castro defends himself in court with his now famous speech, "History will absolve me." This growing disconnect between the wealthy elite and the struggling majority, as we've already seen, begins to spark unrest. So, what happens when a nation holds its breath? When students, farmers, and thinkers all begin to ask the same dangerous questions? We don't have all the answers yet. What we do know is that now the gaze of the Kremlin is also firmly resting on Cuba. And something is telling me that this is not the last time that we will be talking about either Cuba or Fidel Castro. But what we are sure about is that Latin America is a paradox. On paper, the United States, and possibly the godfather of the United Nations, the champion of liberty and democracy, preaches values like self-determination, anti-colonialism, and human rights. These very ideals are etched into the post-war world order it helped design. But in practice, especially in Latin America, those values have very tangible limits. When democracy produces governments that threaten US business interests or lean even slightly toward the left, and in the US's mind toward Moscow, the script changes. The defender of freedom becomes an agent of suppression. The hand that signed the UN Charter also pulls the strings of coups and covert interventions, sometimes even triggers. This isn't mere hypocrisy, it's strategy, it's realpolitik. The Soviet Union too, for its part, wraps itself in contradictions. It claims to support anti-imperialist movements, solidarity among workers, and the liberation of oppressed peoples. In Latin America, it offers ideological support, covert funding, and a narrative of resistance against Yankee imperialism. But Soviet interests aren't purely altruistic. The USSR isn't building a workers' utopia, it is merely expanding its influence across the ocean toward what the US deems its home soil. What the USSR wants is loyalty in the region, access, and the chance to plant ideological seeds deep in the Western Hemisphere, where the US sends dollars, the Soviet Union sends doctrine, and also some rubles. And caught between these two titans, each claiming to be the voice of the people, are the actual people of Latin America. To Washington and Moscow, Latin America isn't a partner, it is a chessboard. Governments become pawns. Elections, revolutions, and reform movements serve as tools to be bent, shaped, or broken depending on who controls the board. The region becomes a test site for how far ideology can stretch before tanks roll in or money changes hands. The Cold War in Latin America isn't cold at all. It burns hot, with assassinations, disappearances, propaganda, and proxy warfare. Superpower competition hollows out the promise of sovereignty. Behind the rhetoric of liberty and revolution, both sides gamble with lives that aren't their own. This is what it means to be the playground of superpowers. The swings still move, the sand is still warmed by the sun, but the games being played are deadly. If you want to be part of this journey, then join our cause and enlist in the TimeGhost army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Together, we can explore historical moments that, well, deserve more exploring. And beyond that, that was it for today. Until next time, Excelsior!